Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet.
He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful town just north of London called Luton. And I love my hometown, but it's one of those places which appears at first glance to have very few redeeming features. But I can tell you, having lived there for over 20 years, that when you scratch beneath the surface, it has none, actually. But I really love my hometown. I love a lot about it. It's just one of those places where you have to dig a bit deeper to find the beauty. You have to be a bit more perceptive to see the stunning kind of things that you might be able to see. And so, for example, here's the view from outside our house where we grew up. And some of you might think, isn't that just a Select Express shop with bollards outside it to stop ram raids? And that is actually what they are for. That shop got ram raided so much when I was growing up. Not by me, but someone's taken the trouble to paint them green, which just shows the kind of care and attention. If you can just see. And it's my hometown, though, and I love it. I'm very fond of it. And my parents had been missionaries in China, and they'd returned to England before I was born. So actually, church and faith were a part of my life from quite a young age. But then I went to high school, and I went to quite a rough high school. It was actually the worst school in Luton, which is quite a difficult accolade to achieve. And in those days, I think these days you'd call it a failing school, largely because it failed and they knocked it down. But when I started that, I realized I was one of only 2 or 3 people out of 800 who went to church or had any kind of faith. And I suddenly realized you didn't have to believe these things. Lots of people didn't. And at the same time, lots of the people I knew at church just stopped coming, walked away from their faith. So I was forced to work out for myself what I really believed about Jesus. It came a point where I had to make a decision on the evidence. Is all this stuff I've been brought up with real? Is it true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true, put my head in the sand and hope it was true, or pretend. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. For me, personally, evidence has always been very important. After Luton, I went on to read law at Oxford. And in fact, I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. And over those years, I defended people, in the criminal courts. So I defended hundreds, probably over 1,000 people accused of crimes. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. And but every day, every case I worked on, the first question was always, what is the evidence about the events? How does a case stack up? The question I asked every day for years was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to Jesus, who Jesus is, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the questions who and why. So suppose I invited you over to my house. We've just met, but you seem nice. And we went into the kitchen, and the kettle was boiling. And you said, well, why is the kettle boiling? Now, I could say, well, the kettle's boiling because there's a heat source and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall, passing into the fluid and causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees, there's a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid expands into a gaseous state. Could say that. Or when you say, why is the kettle boiling? I could say, oh, the kettle's boiling because I wanted to make you a cup of tea, because I thought it'd be nice to have a chat and get to know you. You see, the first answer tells you how things happen, but the second answer tells you that I did it, and it tells you why I did it. And there are some things that only the Maker can reveal, actually. Science is so important, it reveals how, but it doesn't tell you who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is highly important. That's what you put before a jury. The jury aren't witnesses to the events. Every case they're involved in, every time they bring back a verdict, they have to do it based on evidence of other people about the events in question. They have to take, every time they bring back a verdict, a step of faith based on the evidence they've heard. And I myself could not be a Christian if it required me to take some kind of blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of just taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second, I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And I understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest to you is that if I want to know you, I can know a certain amount about you from looking at you, observing you, watching you, and so on. But ultimately, I can only know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God's done that. And he's done it kind of in a way that you might expect, or which makes sense. Because if God was going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the most logical way to do it? It's to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator and that this creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. So first of all, outside of the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The Jewish first century historian Flavius Josephus said, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And sometimes people say, well, the New Testament was written a long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is, we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So a few examples. Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. And no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap. We have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap, and 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it is unique amongst ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and their closeness in time to the original. So the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, an expert in these things, said, in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no serious secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that he existed. But who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, bereavement, suffering, being tortured, and even the experience of death. And many today would say, well, okay, he was a human being, but he was only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there were two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's the end of the argument, really. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, and it's true, he didn't walk around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt that he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part of the argument. What did he say? And then secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus was centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, in pointing people to himself, pointed to God. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know whether you've experienced this. At times in my life, I've thought I've done really well, actually. I've felt like I was very successful in my career. I was earning lots of money, great holidays, great life. I love my job. I worked as I said, as a barrister. When you work as a barrister, you make interesting people all the time. You know, you need a bit of charisma to kind of steal hundreds of millions of pounds or import mass quantities of cocaine. There's an interest about those people. You know, they're quite fun to hang out with every now and again. And I love that, and I love that world. And what's great is when you're in that world and when you're doing that sort of work, when you're working as a barrister, you go to parties and people are fascinated by the kind of work you're doing, and they're really interested in it, and that makes you feel great. And what was even better was some of the people I worked with were some of the best people in the country at what they did. And so if the person knew a little bit about them, then it was even better, because they'd say, oh, you work with them, they're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I go, no. But inside I was thinking, yes. And I loved all that. And I kind of loved the work. I loved what I was doing. I loved the holidays. But what I found was the more stuff I had, the more I was earning, the more successful I was in my career, it never seemed to be enough. Even with all the good things I had in my life, it felt like I always wanted more. I had the only way I could describe it is like a spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there was the stuff in my life I didn't like, the bad habits, the stuff I found very addictive. I don't know what that is for you. For me, it can be sometimes like comparing myself to people. Or Instagram, which is basically the same thing. Or whatever it is you find. Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus set me free from all sorts of stuff, a bad temper, other things. You know, some instantly, some it's taken a bit longer. And then there's stuff like guilt, worry, anxiety, fear. I wonder if you've experienced, like I have, waking up kind of 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting up in bed in the dark, and maybe you're going through a relationship crisis, or people are screaming at you at work because something's gone wrong, and it starts to affect your sleep, and you find yourself awake in the middle of the night. And you sort of think, is it going to be okay? Is this actually going to work out? And Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. You'll find peace. He said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. And we've all probably come across people who perhaps haven't been blessed with a huge amount of modesty or humility, seem to think they're God's gift to the world, who maybe, if you ask them what God looks like, they might think they'd only have to look in the mirror. Maybe you've got a boss like that, or an ex. Jesus didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature, and yet he said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching was centered on himself. But secondly, there were his, what you might call indirect claims. So Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people who he had never met before in his life, he said, your sins are forgiven. And the lawyers said to him, wait a minute, to forgive those who sin against others, that's something that only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins. I've come to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And we don't have time to look at all of them, but if somebody says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, show them this one. And the background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in John 10:30. It says, I and the Father are one. Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Those who were around him, those who heard him and opposed him, said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what Jesus claimed, and they said he deserved to die for it. So from his teaching, his indirect and direct claims, the evidence seems to suggest that Jesus did claim to be God. Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. And it seems to me there are three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and he knew it wasn't true, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and he was an evil one at that. The second possibility is that it wasn't true, but he really thought it was true. He didn't realize it. He thought he was God even though he wasn't. And we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first to say it. Love your enemies. Jesus' teaching has really been the foundation of our whole civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And then think about this. We have advanced in every field of science. Think about just the technological advancements of the last 10 years. Brain implants, nanotechnology, Tinder. But in 2,000 years, no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the sort of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things he did. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. Sometimes people think, well, Christianity is boring, but it wouldn't have been boring being with Jesus. I want you to imagine for a moment you're facing a serious moral dilemma, maybe an ethical issue at work. You've got time for one phone call. Who do you phone? Who's your kind of trustworthy, calm in a crisis, wise, sensible friend who you could phone in that crisis? Picture that person. And then I want you to imagine it's Friday night. You've had some great news. You want to hit the town, go out and celebrate and have a big one, okay? Who would you phone? Who's your go-to party friend, always up for a night out, okay? For me, they're very different people. I would never want to muddle them up. It would get very messy. I'd phone about a work issue, and I'd end up in Shoreditch at 5 a.m. Like, it's just not a good... But what's fascinating is that Jesus hasn't even given the world's greatest moral teaching. He went to a party, the wine ran out, and he says, oh, you see those stone jars over there? Fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of water and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. It might surprise you. Jesus was the one who kept the party going. And not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people who society had written off. The way he set people free and still sets people free today. It's one of the things I most love about Jesus. And of course, I suppose, ultimately, his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him very well said, this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what we're like when we're seriously under pressure. When we make a mistake at work and our boss is coming after us. When a relationship in which we've placed all our hopes breaks down. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. Now, some might say, oh, well, Jesus read the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever conman. He read it and he thought, oh, I'll go and fulfill these prophecies. I'll go around doing all this stuff. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of them, but also because there were many things he simply had no control over. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. I mean, imagine Jesus reading the Old Testament saying, oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had no control over. And then by far the most important thing, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every single one of us here. I mean, every one of us here is going to die. I feel a little bit awkward bringing it up in central London on a Wednesday night. But it's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? One of us in this room will die. And you might have noticed that we struggle a little bit in our culture with the whole idea of death. In the media, when a famous person dies, even in tragic circumstances, the death is reported, but then quite quickly we move on to talking about what a wonderful person they are. It's like we can't even sit with the reality of death for more than a moment. We don't like to talk about death. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And I will never forget, actually, going to the funeral of my great friend Jamie, who died in really tragic circumstances, and just being there, kind of weeping at this funeral, and seeing his coffin, and seeing it being lowered into the ground. And it looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end, unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for every one of us to have eternal life. And that is an extraordinary claim. And it's the basis of hope at every funeral. But is it true? I mean, that's what matters. Just because it's great to believe doesn't mean it's true. So why do I believe Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I hadn't realized just how much evidence there is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. So some say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. Well, that's not at all likely, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people were saying, Jesus is risen from the dead, is, no, he's not. We've got him here. We'll just wheel him out. Others have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body, and then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded, and it's also psychologically improbable. Here is a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something which they would have known, if they'd taken the body, was not true? And some say, well, maybe the robbers stole the body. They were robbers. And that's the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent. And when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing for the robbers to take. They had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly emerges. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had kind of been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. The second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. And sometimes people say, well, yeah, that's hallucination. And yeah, people do hallucinate. The kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people who have taken drugs. But among Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, who was the ultimate skeptic. You had a tough, gritty fisherman. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not tend to hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even 2 people would have the same hallucination. But Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at one time. 500 people don't have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. Here was a group of people who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them. So 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everybody, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and the growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. And it's a story of peaceful revolution without parallel, really, in the history of the world. And the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives which have been transformed by Jesus. More people now, actually, than ever before. Tens of thousands of people a day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today, there's 2,300,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. And we have Christian experience down the ages, countless millions of people who have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, every continent, every nationality, every socio-economic range, every intellectual background, from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded, it just seems unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there is all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And actually, when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. And Jesus said, I have come so you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And I tell you, I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties. I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I have experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope for this life. And right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be.